Morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening to those of you joining us from other time zones. Thanks for joining us for our quarterly technical webinar. We have an exciting and much asked for webinar today. Brian Huffman will be your presenter as we discuss how Panzura CloudFS can be optimized to work with Microsoft's DFS-N. Brian is a member of our technical support team and has over 20 years experience working with Active Directory, Samba, Microsoft Networking, and Revit. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items. You'll be muted during the presentation. On your GoToWebinar console, there is a questions section. Please enter your questions there and we will cover them at the end during the Q&A section. And now, Brian, let me hand this over to you.
All right, thank you, May, for that introduction, and thank you to everybody for joining us. Today, we will discuss optimizing collaboration with Panzura CloudFS and Microsoft DFS-N. Now, before we get into it, let's have a brief overview of the Panzura Freedom Collaboration solution. So here we can see that the Panzura Freedom Collaboration eliminates the impact of latency, and it empowers global users to collaborate in real time. The core of this is the Panzura CloudFS. Panzura CloudFS is a collection of filers that share file system metadata and data by leveraging cloud storage. The solution facilitates collaboration by providing byte range locking, and it eliminates delays in opening or synchronizing files, especially in advanced applications such as Revit or Civil 3D. Because the metadata is identical in every Panzura filer throughout the organization, you will see the same file system no matter where you are. Now, here's how it works. Let's say you have a user over here in the US and they create a file. And then they go ahead and write that file to their local Panzura filer. Now, as soon as that happens, we break it up into the corresponding metadata and data objects. So next, that data is written to the cloud, and then it's soon followed by the metadata. As soon as that metadata gets to the cloud, the peer filers download the metadata, and their file systems show the file as being present in their file systems. Now, if this user over here in the UK wants to get to that file, he's going to attempt to open it. The filer downloads the data objects, and then the user receives the file. If the data needed from the cloud is only incremental changes, the download is nearly instantaneous. So this sounds great, but how do we get access to this data? Well, there are a couple of ways you can get to the data. Your first option is to connect directly to the filers and shares. When you do this, you would go to the typical network path of filer name / SMB share. And the user can either browse to this location, or you can set up a mapped drive. This doesn't require admin rights to set up, and you don't even need domain credentials to get to that data. You could use local users and groups. The big drawback to this method is that users in every site need to know the name of their local filer, or you can create custom mappings at that site. And if that mapped data if that mapped targeted filer is not reachable, your path no longer works. Since the other filers in CloudFS are still set up, you could still connect to one of the peer filers and you would see the same data there. The option we're going to discuss today is CloudFS via DFS-N. And DFS-N helps manage files and folders by providing a logical directory structure that masks the physical file servers that host the data. You don't need to know the name of the local Panzura filer if you wish to connect to it. You only need to know the DFS-N path. So we use DFS-N namespace, not DFS replication. DFS replication is Microsoft's solution to keeping the same data in many locations at once. And this results in you having copies of data at each location. The problem with this is that you can't actively collaborate across sites, and you run risks of changes at one site overriding the changes someone else is trying to make. The Panzura CloudFS manages the data and metadata to ensure there is always one authoritative copy of the data and this eliminates the need for replication, so we only use DFS-N. With DFS-N, you create the DFS namespace, root shares, and folder links on the domain controller that is running the DFS service. Once that is done, you add the target paths of the Panzura filers to those folder links, and then at this point, the user connects to the namespace by going to / domain name / root share, and they can even go to /folder. They don't have to know the filer they're connecting to. DFS handles that. And since the namespace is stored in Active Directory, it's available at any of the servers that host the service and the root. To take advantage of this solution, you're going to want to have the following. You're going to want Panzura CloudFS with SMB shares. You're going to need Active Directory sites and services. And with that, you're going to configure subnets and sites. And you're going to want to have the DFS management tool. With this, you would create the namespace, which is domain-based, your directory links or your folders, and then you would point those links to the physical targets, in our case, the Panzura filer shares. So let's assume we already have the Panzura CloudFS set up and our SMB shares are ready to go. Next, let's take a look at Active Directory sites and services. DFS-N is dependent upon Active Directory sites and services, and sites and services helps DFS-N know where to send client connections. To do this, you're going to need to have the subnets defined, and we got them already defined on this screen. And then after this, you're going to create the various sites. Next, you're going to add subnets to the corresponding sites. As you can see here, this site already has a subnet assigned. You can have multiple subnets assigned to a site, but please keep in mind that you want to make sure that all devices in the same site are truly local to each other. In other words, they should all be in the same local network. This is because DFS uses this information to connect clients to the correct physical target. And since we're talking about DFS, let's take a look at that. Here we can see the DFS management tool. Within this tool, we create the namespace. The namespace is basically a root share that holds all the folders or links that correspond to the actual shares we wish to use on the physical filers. So these links, they're going to have more, these links can have one or more physical targets associated with them. In this case, projects has targets in San Francisco, Austin, and Paris. These targets make up the referral list that the DFS server sends to the clients when the client attempts to open the link. Now, the client connects to the namespace just like a regular file share. So as we said, it's / domain name / namespace, and they can go to / folder like projects. And during this connection, the client is told that this is a DFS link, and then the client is sent a referral list from the DFS service. And the referral list is based upon the referral ordering method that we will cover very shortly here. The client just gets a basic list of physical targets. And the client's going to connect to the first physical target on this list. And if the folder has more than one target and there's a target in the client's site, that target is going to get listed first. So the client's always going to try the target in the same local site. And once the client gets this list of referral targets, the client doesn't need to talk to DFS anymore. It's going to cache this information locally, and it's going to go through that list if either the connection expires or it loses connection to that client. Once the client loses connection or the connection times out, it's going to try the next target on the list. And if the client exhausts the list, it's going to go to DFS and say, give me a new list. Now, over here, we're looking at the ordering method. This is partially how the list is built by DFS. We'd go to that by just right-clicking on the namespace or the folder link, right-click, referrals, and ordering method. And here we can see the 3 ordering methods available in DFS-N. And we're going to discuss these particular ordering methods very shortly here. We can also override the directory link settings on the particular folder targets pane. So in this case, We right-clicked on projects, we went to referrals, and we can check the exclude targets outside of the client site setting. That means that even though the namespace might have least cost or random set, we can make sure that this particular physical target has a more restrictive referral order method that is going to be required for certain products such as Revit and a lot of CAD applications. Those applications do not tolerate high latency being anything over 1 millisecond. Bad things can happen in those applications, including data corruption. So you want to make sure you force the clients to only connect to the same local site. So here's some ordering methods here. Now, one thing to keep in mind, all three of these ordering methods have something in common. If you have a physical target in the same local site, that's going to be selected first. What differs is how it handles the remote connections, the remote targets. So in the case of random order, targets in the same site as the client are listed in random order. They're going to be listed immediately after the local target. And as we discussed earlier, the client gets this list and it just works from the list from the top down. So the client's going to connect to the local target, and then it's going to try one of the other targets that are listed randomly. The next option we have here is lowest cost. So with lowest cost, once again, we're still going to get the local targets listed first, but everything below that is going to be listed based upon the link cost. So if I'm connecting from Paris, my list should have Paris first, and then the other targets listed down below based upon the cost of getting there, and everybody in the same site should get the same list. The ordering method we're most interested in is what we consider our best practice, exclude targets outside of the client site. What this will do is this will ensure that all connections are only going to go to the same local site. Paris users are going to connect to the Paris filers. UK users will connect to the UK filers, and so on. So the reason why we want to choose exclude targets outside the local site is that this prevents clients from jumping around to different filers just because of a network blip. As we know, networks can be lossy at times, and we don't want the connection to jump around. You can have problems with high latency. Suddenly the user is going from a 1 millisecond connection to 150 or 200 milliseconds, and they're going to be calling up your IT desk and saying, hey, my connection is slow, what happened? Through some investigation, we'll find out they're no longer talking to their local site. There can also be some application level locking that essentially gets abandoned on the filer, and until the connection gracefully times out, that lock is going to be held. So we definitely don't want that to happen, because then people are going to have a hard time accessing their data. Another reason is there's some internal locking methods within the Panzura file system that could be left behind. And once again, after those time out, they'll clear up. So in most cases, we're going to want to make sure the users connect to their local Panzura filer. Now, if that's not possible, then we're going to use lowest cost. But once again, we do not want to use that with latency sensitive applications such as CAD applications and Revit. So even though we would use something like lowest cost or random order, most of the time lowest cost, we can still customize the target selection to ensure that we try to get users to the best possible physical target. In our example here, we have a directory folder link called projects-London. This is intended for users that are sitting in London. As we can see in our referral list over here, we actually don't have a Panzura filer sitting in London, but we know that Paris is the closest, so we can go ahead and right-click on this Paris folder target, and down below you can see we got the properties. We can override the referral ordering, and we can set that to be first among all targets. And that would mean that everybody who connects to the projects-London folder link, they're going to get Paris listed first. As a caveat, you also want to make sure to know that that will also affect users in Austin or San Francisco. We're overriding the ordering method, so Paris will always be listed first. So here's some of our best practices. Once again, you want to configure referral ordering method, exclude targets outside of the client site. You want to do this all the time whenever possible. If you have Panzura filers in all your sites and you're creating a new namespace, and we're going to cover this in a scenario, you can just configure this at the namespace level. But let's say you're bringing in the Panzuras and you're adding them to an existing namespace. You can leave the existing namespace at whatever configuration you have there, and then you can configure this at the directory link level. And once again, latency-sensitive applications such as Revit must use this ordering method. You do not want the users connecting to any targets that have a higher than 1 millisecond latency with something like Revit. Another thing is when we configure these folder targets, we're going to want to use the fully qualified domain name. This is going to help avoid issues of, let's say, you got a VPN user and their DNS suffix search order is not fully configured, or if you have the same short machine name across your domain forest. Using the fully qualified domain name will ensure that users connect to the exact physical target you always want them to. And we're also going to want to add the folder targets at the SMB share level. So in our case, it's going to be, let's say, //Panzura01 /share1 /subfolder. We don't have to use a subfolder. We can just mount to the share. Here's the use cases we're going to cover. We're going to cover configuring ordering methods on the namespace, and we're also going to cover configuring directory link configuration. We're going to use two namespaces. One is going to be DFS demo, and that one is going to be the one with all Panzura filers in sites using our best practices. And the other is going to be the existing namespace where some of the sites have Panzura filers. In that case, we're going to configure a couple of different ways. We're going to show how you want to customize latency sensitive sites. So in this case, we're going to make it so that it's going to be compatible with Revit and other AEC applications. And we're also going to show how to customize for latency insensitive sites, for example, the user home directory. And we're actually going to use the user home directory in our example. And today, this is the environment that we're going to be using. We have 3 Panzura filers running 7160. The filers are located in San Francisco, Austin, and Paris. We have shares that are already pre-configured. We have the project share, finance share, marketing, and users. We're also going to have 2 clients, one in Austin, one in London. You'll note that we have a client in London, but we don't have any Panzura filers local in London. That'll be important because that is essentially our non-optimal configuration. And then for our domain is pztraining.local. We have our domain controller, which is DC02 in Austin. And we already have the services, Active Directory sites and services, and DFS management pre-installed and ready to go. So at this point, I'm going to switch over to the demo. Just give me a moment, please. And here we are with the demo. I'm currently on our domain controller, DC02. I got my little cheat sheet over here. It's in Austin. Here's my Panzura filers in San Francisco, Austin, Paris. So let's start off with the Active Directory Sites and Services tool. As you can see here, it's already pre-configured. In many of your environments, your network administrators will already be using sites and services and already have it pre-configured, so we won't spend too much time on it. But typically what you'll do is you would set up so that each of the subnets in your environment are added here to the subnets folder. Once you've done that, you're going to add your various sites. Now, when you first install this tool, default first site name is already going to be there. Very shortly thereafter, you're going to create your sites, and you're not going to use default first site name. And if we take a look at one of these subnets, we can see this is assigned to the Paris site. And if I take a look at any of my sites, it will show all the subnets listed. So you can have more than one subnet in a particular site. Just please remember, you want to make sure they're all truly local. The reason being is DFS management and the DFS service is going to use your site information and send you to your DFS targets, and it's going to do that based upon the domain site that you're in. So at that point, I'm pretty much done with Active Directory sites and services. I'm going to go back over to DFS management. So for the first thing we're going to do here is, let's say I'm installing Panzura filers, brand new environment, and I want to have it all in its own namespace. I'll just go over here to create a new namespace. And since I'm on DC02, I'm going to use that as the first domain server that I'm going to create this in. And I'm going to give this namespace a name, in this case, DFS demo. And we're going to go ahead and take these defaults here. It's going to be a domain-based namespace. That way it's replicated across all my domain servers that are hosting DFS versus a standalone namespace, which is only going to sit on one DC. And then I'm going to go ahead and create. Wait a few moments. And our namespace is created. Now I have this fancy new namespace with nothing in it. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and create a target. I'm going to do this. Here, I'm going to do a physical folder link and new folder. For this one, I'm going to create it for the finance group. So I give it a name, and then these are the folder targets or the physical links, the Panzura filers that it's going to be going to. So I have pz-cc1. I want to put my fully qualified domain name. And here is my finance directory. And since we're in CloudFS, we have the same environment across all the Panzura filers. And oops, actually, before I do that, I'm going to cancel that. Since I am creating this for Panzura filers, and I'm making sure that this is going to be optimal and following our best practice, I'll just go in here to Properties, Referrals, and I'll change this ordering method to exclude targets outside of the client site. By setting it here in the namespace, this is going to ensure that all the folder links that are created inside of this namespace are going to follow this ordering method. And with that being done, let's go ahead and create that new folder. As we said, it's going to be finance. I'm going to put in my name of my Panzura filer, pz-cc1.pz training.local. And here we go. We got the finance share already exists on pz-cc1. Since all these filers are in the same CloudFS, I expect to find the same share on all my filers. So I'll go ahead and add my second physical target, which is pz-cc2.pz training.local. And there's finance. And I'll just go ahead and do the same for my third physical target, pz-cc3.pz training.local. I'll hit OK. And now I get this prompt that asks me if I want to set a replication group. We do not want a replication group. As we discussed earlier, replication is Microsoft's way of trying to sync files between different folder targets. In our case, the Panzura solution already handles all that for you. So we don't need replication. We only need DFS-N. So we're going to say no here. And my folder target. It is there. And if I create other folder links under here, they will all look very similar depending upon what physical targets I define in there. In this case, you can see those 3 physical targets I defined here. One's in San Francisco, one's in Austin, one's in Paris. So that's creating a new namespace. Let's say you are working with an existing namespace. If we take a look at my next one here, domain shares already exist. There are already some folder links here. And if I take a look at the configuration for this namespace, we see it's configured for lowest cost. And as we've discussed, lowest cost is not optimal for most use cases. We want to make sure that we have better optimized folder links for our Panzura targets. So let's take a look at this first one here. I'm going to create a folder target, folder link. It's going to be called projects. So anybody out there using Revit or familiar with Revit has seen this share before. Revit is very common with Revit to use this. So I don't have any folder targets yet. So just like I did on the other folder link, I will go ahead and add my folder targets. And you see these projects. Oh, there's already stuff there. And to save some time, I'm going to copy this, paste it, and just modify the physical target. And I'm going to hit OK and node replication. And we've created the folder, but we have not customized it yet. But customizing it is just a few more clicks. As you can see on the right-hand side, we have those folder targets. I want to make sure this is optimal for Revit. So if I set exclude targets outside of the client site, that will ensure clients in Paris are only going to go to the Paris filer. Clients in Austin are only going to go to the Austin filer. Clients in San Francisco are only going to go to the San Francisco filer. And everybody else will not be participating in this particular folder link, which in the case of a product like Revit, that's a very good thing. Here we'll avoid user complaints and corruption. So in that case, projects is configured. So now let's say we have another use case, users. Let's say the general users directory. And we know that this is for user private shares. They're not latency sensitive. They would like to connect locally, but if they can't connect locally, it's not going to be the end of the world. They're not going to corrupt data. We'll go ahead and create, add in our folder targets. This is very similar to the other ones we configured. I will copy and paste. And I'll hit OK. I'll say node replication. And since we are okay with this using least cost, we're done with this one. If we can see here, it already has a referral configuration for lowest cost. And we're going to leave it that way because these users are not latency sensitive. Whatever applications they're working with, it's not going to be a huge impact. They might still complain if somebody's in Austin and suddenly they're talking on the Paris filer because now they have high latency, but it's not going to be breaking their applications. So let's say we have to customize the target because we want to force users to go to a certain location. Let's take a look at marketing-London. We've already pre-configured this. As you can see, we have our 3 sites here. And this has the default configuration of lowest cost. And as we know, everybody can get to any of the physical targets here, including my users in London. Now, I have it set up this way because my users in London actually need data from the marketing share, but they do not have a London Panzura filer. We have San Francisco, Austin, and Paris. Now, I want to make the configuration of this as optimal as possible for these users. So I'm going to try to strongly encourage their connections to go to London first. To do that, I want to make sure the referral list shows the closest physical target first all the time. The way I do that is I look at this and say, I know Paris is pretty close to London. Let me go ahead and go to the properties here. And I'm going to override the referral ordering, and I'm going to make Paris first among all targets. When I enable this, that means everybody connecting to pztraining.local/domain shares/marketing-London is going to see Paris listed first. This also includes users for San Francisco and Austin. So everybody using this folder link is going to get Paris listed first. And that's it. We've configured Active Directory sites and services. We've configured DFS management. Let's see how this works. So I'm going to go over to my remote desktop. And here we have a desktop computer. This one is sitting in Austin. You might have noticed a slight change here. My data over here now says Austin. We still got the Panzura filers here. And as we remember, this Austin site has a Panzura filer. So everything we've configured with our best practice of exclude targets outside the local site, everything with the best practice we should be able to get to. Let's see if that works. Okay, so I'm going to go here, pztraining.local. We have our namespaces. We have DFS demo. We have domain shares. Let's go to DFS demo first. I have exactly one folder link here, finance, and I can get to that, and there's some data there. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to right-click on a blank area. I'm going to go to properties, and one thing you'll notice that's different compared to a regular network connection, regular share, is since this is a DFS target, we have a DFS tab. In this case, because we've set this up to exclude targets outside the local site, this is the referral list. He's got one whole physical target listed, PZ-CC2, which happens to be the Austin Panzura filer. So we know this works. Let me go back to my other namespace, the existing namespace domain shares. Now, if we remember, we created a couple of folder targets here. We created projects, which we intend to be for Revit users. They're very latency sensitive. I can get to that. The reason I can get to that is because I have a physical target that's local to me, PZ-CC2. On our other demo system that is not local to any of these sites, we would expect this to fail. So since this is only for, this is set up to exclude targets outside the local site, our referral list has exactly one. So that works great. Let me take a look at one of the other folder links, users. I can get to users. If we remember, we left this at the default of lowest cost. So I expect this to show more than one physical target. Here we go. It shows all the physical targets. And as you can see, we are connected to PZ-CC2, which is the local Austin Panzura filer. We would expect that to happen most of the time, but if the client runs into issues and for some reason can't reach Austin at the exact moment that it wants to, it will connect to one of these other Panzura filers, depending upon which is closest. Most likely the San Francisco site, because that should be the next closest on the network. But as you can see here, least cost shows all the physical targets. And if we go over to Marketing London, and I can get to it, I have the physical targets. And in this case, even though I'm in Austin, I'm connected to the Paris filer. Now, this is because we customized the targets for this folder link, so everybody connecting to Marketing-London is going to go to Paris first. This is the intended behavior for this folder target, so as we can see, that is working. So we're done with the Austin site. Let's jump over to London. All right, so here we are in London. If I go ahead and try to connect to my namespaces, easytraining.local, I am not going to be able to reach DFS demo. The reason I'm not going to be able to reach DFS demo is because there are no targets in that namespace that exist in London. So there's no folder links that are eligible for connection for this user. And in this case, we don't even get an error message. Let's go over to our other namespace, domain shares. And we have plenty of folder links here. So if you remember, we created projects. Projects is set up to exclude targets outside the local site. We know we're in London. We do not have a Panzura filer in London. So if I go and click on this, it's not going to let me in. Windows gives me some strange archaic message, but essentially this means you can't use that because if we were to look at the referral list would be blank because the referral list is only going to list local physical targets. And in this case, there's nothing to show. Now, we also configured users. I can get to users. Now, why can I get to users? Because the referral list that I got lists all 3 Panzura filers. And in this case, he decided to connect to Paris. That's good. And as we said, if it doesn't connect to Paris, it'll connect to Austin or San Francisco. It's set up for least cost, so it will try to get to Paris for this particular folder link for this particular user. And now let's take a look at this folder link that we configured specifically for London. So in this case, we can also get to this because it's using least cost. And if we look at the properties, we have our 3 physical targets listed, and he's connected to Paris. Now, these other folder links also work. I can double click and I can change to it. I don't want to because I don't want my London user to talk to San Francisco. I'll just jump back over to Paris. But as you can see, it preferred the Paris physical target. So these are different ways we can configure. Now, of course, as we discussed quite a few times, I'll just flip over here real briefly. Whenever possible, we want to make sure we use exclude targets outside of the client site. This will ensure that clients connect only to the local site with a low latency connection. And with some applications that require low latency connections, you'll avoid problems with those applications. And with that, we're pretty much done with the demo section. Let me go back over to my PowerPoint. And that's pretty much it. There's a few reference documents that you'll have access to. The first one listed here is our Panzura document regarding DFS-N, basically configuring it in Windows and essentially what we went through in this presentation. There's a couple of other documents listed here. Here's a Microsoft document that DFS namespace overview if you want to read more about DFS. And here's another Microsoft document here. It's more specifically about setting the ordering method for the targets and the referrals. And one thing I want to emphasize is you always want to try to use exclude targets outside the local site. That will make the user experience much more smooth. It's probably not necessarily going to be covered in these Microsoft documents. It should be in our DFS document, but it's definitely in this presentation. You want to make sure you use that setting. And with that being said, I want to thank everybody for your time. We're done with the presentation, and it looks like we have some time for some questions, so I'll hand it back over to May.
Thank you, Brian. We do have a couple of questions. How does exclude targets outside of client site work with remote employees that are in areas without a filer? In other words, how would you set that up to work?
Okay. So let's say you have a user that is remote. They are not in a site that has a Panzura filer. If I go back to my first or second slide, we can kind of look at a little graphic here. So let's say I have a user in Australia, and let's say they did not have a Panzura filer there. Let's say that wasn't there. And they want to connect to a physical folder link that is set to exclude targets outside the local site. If all they did is configure exclude targets outside the local site, they will not access any data. Now, if this folder link needs to be configured that way for the application, in other words, we need to exclude targets outside the local site, then for this user to have access to data, they're going to need to be on a computer that's actually local to a Panzura filer. One common way people do that is they have a virtual desktop in one of the other sites. So where I commonly see this is, let's say in AEC firms where they might have a satellite office with 2 or 3 users. So they don't want to put a Panzura filer in there for the 2 or 3 users, but those users all need to work in projects. In that case, the most cost-effective method is probably for them to use virtual desktop in a site that has a Panzura filer, because oftentimes the applications they're using, the latency from the storage, in this case the Panzura filer, to the client computer, in this case the virtual desktop, is going to be less than 1 millisecond, versus if they are going across the WAN to access the storage, the latency is going to be too high and they can corrupt projects.
Thank you, Brian. Next question. Is there a way to force a site that doesn't have a filer to a specific site that does?
Yes. So if we go over to here, so in this case, we have this marketing-London folder link. We have changed the properties here to force Paris to be the first among all targets. So May, the question was, how do they get a site that does not have a local Panzura filer to always go to a particular site? This would do it. However, this is going to affect everybody using Marketing London. So everybody else would probably just use the regular marketing folder link, but users in London, to ensure that they're always going to the Paris filer as much as possible, they will go here. And we can't force them to go there with this configuration. It just encourages them by having Paris listed first. The only way we can force a user to connect to a particular site is using exclude targets outside the local site.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Question on costs themselves. How can costs be adjusted? We have DFS configured, but certain sites are going to the wrong filer. I think it would be good to send out a reference afterwards rather than go through this during the demo, during the webinar.
Okay.
How do you feel about that?
Yeah, we can send that out. We can probably send a couple of slides out.
Yeah. Let's see. Are there any more questions coming? While we wait, I will go ahead and launch our poll to see what you would like to see as our next webinar. Please take a few seconds to respond to the poll. And let us know what is a topic you'd like to see uppermost during our April webinar. And take this a few more seconds. I have about 70% of the audience voting. If the remaining folks could vote as well, that'd be awesome. Okay, I will be closing the polls now. Okay, it looks like understanding intelligent caching is the winner by far. So we'll focus on that for our next webinar. Are there any more questions that we can go over from the audience? Thank you very much, Brian. This was a wonderful presentation, and we will go ahead and end this now. We will send out the webinar link as well as the documentation references shortly. And thank you everyone for attending, and have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.